We start in a second. Yeah, we start right now. Yeah, my name is Andreas Novy. I am a professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business and president of the International Polanyi Society, and I will have the pleasure to lead you to this event today. And I'm very happy that so many of you joined us here for this public lecture of the 9th Vienna Polanyi visiting professor Lucas Chancel. Welcome, Lucas. Yeah, and it's really a pleasure to also welcome Veronika Kaup-Hasler, Vienna's Executive City Councillor for Cultural Affairs and Science. A long-standing supporter of the Polanyi visiting professorships. I remember 4 years ago, when Nancy Fraser was the first visiting professor, and that was during Corona, I think we were 7 to 10 people in the Wappensaal of the city hall of Vienna, transmitting it to the world. I think we had 1,500 people attending, and you gave the welcome address at this event, and we'll give a welcome address in a few seconds here as well. Thank you very much. And I also welcome Bernadette Kamleiter, Vice-Rector for Research and Third Mission at Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien. I also welcome Carsten Schneider. He is the incoming interim president and rector of Central European University. It's an event of very kind of important person. And Carsten Schneider also is linked to the Polanyi Society because he's member of the steering committee who is choosing the professors together with Bernhard Kittel, who cannot join us, professor at the University of Vienna. And then we have, to our surprise, also our new finance minister, Markus Matterbauer, who is a friend and colleague of Lucas Chancel, and he took the time to join us here as well. Welcome, Markus, as well. Yeah, very quick, because there will be a laudatio now. Lucas Chancel is professor of economics at Sciences Po in Paris, co-director of the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics, and senior advisor at the European Tax Observatory. As we have several welcome addresses and we all look forward to the speech, I will, without further ado, hand over to Jamie Woitynek, representative of the Volkshochschule Wien, the Vienna's Adult Education Center, for their welcome address, and they will be followed by Veronika Kaup-Hasler and Vice-Rector Bernadette Kamleiter. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Good evening, dear co-hosts, colleagues and guests, dear Professor Lucas Chancel. My name is Jamie Woitynek and I work for the Vienna Adult Education Centers in the Department of International Projects and Innovation. And I'm honored to welcome you tonight at the VHS Urania. I want to say thank you tonight. Thank you to my colleagues from Urania, to the co-hosts and colleagues from the International Polanyi Society, the Vienna University for Economics and Business, the Central European University, and the University of Vienna, of course. And thank you to the audience for joining us tonight for the keynote and public lecture from Professor Lucas Chancel on energy, inequality, and democracy. These public lectures play significant roles for adult education in general and for public knowledge transfer in Vienna specifically. Since their beginnings, the Vienna adult education centers work tirelessly on old and also new ways to engage with knowledge transfer and education. This, for instance, includes academic and theoretical approaches of understanding worlds, individual educational processes, and approaches of lifelong learning. I believe it is a democratic approach to have the public lectures of the Karl Polanyi guest professorship take place at the Vienna Adult Education Centers. In my opinion, this highlights that academia can very much leave its institutions for a while and also engage with structures and spheres of adult education, commits with us to public knowledge transfer, but it shows simultaneously that the Vienna Adult Education Centers engage with academic and scientific ways of understanding the world around us, as it is a very important pillar of our work. This cooperation, therefore, makes me very proud. Together, we managed to establish a very important collaboration for a transformative educational landscape in Vienna. I am now very honored to welcome and hand over to the City Councillor for Cultural Affairs and Science of the City of Vienna, Veronika Kaup-Hasler. Thank you all and a very warm welcome at the VHS Urania. And Veronika Kaup-Hasler, the stage is yours.
Bonsoir. Bonsoir, Monsieur Chancel. Bonsoir à tous. A warm welcome to everyone who is here. I just shortened a little bit up. Thank you, Minister Martin Bauer, for being here, for joining. I think this room already shows that we need these open spaces for dialogue and for reflection, and it's specifically in that space where adult education is really at the core, trying to translate what is very often only in the echo chambers of academic discourses to others. And this is what we miss today and nowadays. And I'm just about reading a very disturbing book by Douglas Rushkoff. It's Surviving of the Richest. It's about how the richest, who are responsible for so much catastrophes of ecological nature, of misdistribution of money, of social injustice, are planning actually, and they're investing billions of money into leaving this planet. Well, in a way, I would like them to succeed very soon and really to get off this planet because they are about to destroy it. And I think we have to, in the core of Karl Polanyi, there was this incredible insight that the market, that the free market, has to have limits and have to be contained somehow in order to follow also the developments of society. And what we see now, it's in the last 30, 40 years, and unfortunately nobody is going on at the streets and for demonstrations for that. The inequality became bigger and bigger, and the gap between the richest and the poorest and also the middle class became bigger and bigger. And this is not ideology, it's a fact. It's just a simple fact. And whoever is in charge in politics, wherever the persons are coming from, they have to deal with that matter. How we come to equality, how do we share resources, what does our economical system does to our nature, to the things we are living from. And therefore I'm absolutely happy about the choices and about what that the board chooses really young, if I may say so, yes, still it is always a matter of comparison, you know, but young scholars, young academics who develop Karl Polanyi's ground thinkings into the here and now, and really facing the challenges of the now. And so I'm glad for everyone who really can stay the whole time. I will creep out, not because I'm ignorant to what is following, but I have another thing to do tonight, but I will stay at least for the first moments to be. Thank you so much, and enjoy Vienna. Spread the word and take others to your lectures. Thank you so much for being here.
Another warm welcome is forthcoming, and as I'm the third one with two others in front of me and I had no clue what they were to say, my welcome address can be very short. I just would like to introduce myself briefly again. Bernadette Kamleiter. I'm here in my role as Vice-Rector for Research and Third Mission at VU Vienna, one of the institutions that founded this wonderful professorship, together with the EU and together with the University of Vienna. So this professorship was established, and we've heard it before, in 2021. In 2021, many people had a lot of things to do, but it was not about meeting other people. And yet, at this point in time, a joint professorship was established that essentially thrives from visiting each other and from contributing one's knowledge to a broader audience. This initiative is only possible because there have been establishments that were in existence already and that were supporting it. Front and foremost, the International Karl Polanyi Society and the Vienna Adult Education Center. But it's also something that would not have been possible without bigger support, and I think we've seen it before already with Veronika, Kaup-Hasler, showing the support of the city of Vienna, not just in making it possible, but in showing up in person also. And the same holds for the Chamber of Commerce, which has also, of Labor, sorry, which has also been supporting this endeavor. So every term, one professor is invited to come to Vienna and share their insights in the spirit of Karl Polanyi. Chancel is the 9th Karl Polanyi visiting professor, and the question is, what does it take to become one of those professors? For that, it takes some understanding of who Karl Polanyi was. I don't pretend to have a deep understanding, but what I do know is that he was a Hungarian-Austrian citizen of the world. So really thinking broadly already in terms of his own understanding of his identity. And he believed that economic systems should promote systems, or should become systems that serve human cooperation and solidarity. He believed that the economy needs to be put in its place, whatever place that might be. It's a place that is to sustain a good life for all, whatever a good life again is. And that's why it takes so many scholars to come forth and discuss what this all means. Today, one of the things we know is that good life means also not trespassing the planetary boundaries that we have, and we've learned about their existence in only the past few decades. A couple of previous scholars that got this distinct honor also talked about it, and today we'll hear a little bit more about the planetary boundaries, and in particular about how to address, how to thrive within those boundaries and to understand critical issues like inequality, energy transition, and their implications for the global economy. You will correct everything later on. Whatever's been missing, you are going to fill us in on it. I think this is very, very important. It's so important that it essentially brought you all here, this very important topic, and I'm hopeful that there will be also some of our students among your ranks. So at VU and many other universities and institutions in Vienna and Austria and Europe, we are recognizing that this is very important, and so we're constantly introducing new study programs that are helping in that direction. We just established a new stream in our bachelor program. There's an international master program spanning across different European universities in the making on global sustainability management. So those of you who want to take their education for more than one evening, you might just look up the many possibilities at VU and other institutions. So, but before that, I'm not taking any more of your time. I wish you all an inspiring lecture. I'm very happy to see so many of you here, and hand over to Ms. Disslbacher for the Laudatio. Oh, no, to you? Thank you.
It's nearly handing over. Just one sentence on Fanziska Disslbacher. She's assistant professor at the INEQ, the Institute for Equality. Again, the floor is yours.
So, dear colleagues, dear guests, dear Luca, so it is my great honor and pleasure, does this work? Yeah. To deliver the Laudatio, honoring and recognizing the contributions of this year's Karl Polanyi guest professor, Luca Chancel. So, Luca, to me, is one of the most influential and especially most inspiring economists of his generation. And I hope that my words that will follow convince you that these are more than words. So Luca's research combines empirical rigorosity with theoretical ambitions, novel theoretical frameworks, and public engagement. And he's addressing the most pressing challenges of our times in their interrelationships. The rise of extreme inequality in income and wealth, the urgency of the ecological transition, as well as the erosion of democratic institutions. So crucially, he does not treat these crises in isolation, but is deeply devoted to understanding how they relate to each other. I also think that a quick glance at today's news, probably as on most days in these times, makes the relevance of his research unmistakably clear. In preparing these words, I chose not to give you a chronological overview of what he has been working on and of all his contributions. Instead, I've tried to structure his work along three dimensions: the foundations, the core, and what I name the deliberation. So let me begin with the foundations. And these are closely linked to his already mentioned role as co-director of the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics. This research center has, over the past decade, transformed and shaped an entire research field, the study of economic inequalities from not only a within country, but a global perspective. This lab provides the infrastructure that brings together researchers from across the globe who are united by a common mission: the development of high quality, comparable, open access data on the distribution of income and wealth and the resulting CO2 emissions, and to inform the public based on this data and novel evidence, thereby democratizing access to knowledge. And I dare say that without this lab, the entire field of inequality research would not have developed or gained the recognition to the extent it has today and during the last decade. The lab's and Luca's most visible product, so to speak, the World Inequality Report, is really a landmark study in global social sciences. But it does not simply describe inequality within countries or between countries. It makes them visible, and it helps to understand the drivers and the consequences. While Luca's work via the lab, the World Inequality Lab, the effort of gathering data on inequalities might at times seem to be a bit a technical endeavor, Luca's research really shows why these foundations in terms of data are essential. They provide the empirical basis for understanding how inequality in income and wealth connects to and also amplifies other dimensions of inequalities and injustice, such as inequality in emissions, inequality in the exposure to climate risk, and the capacity to adapt to these risks. So let me now turn to what I consider to be the core of Luca's work. Research that became possible precisely because of these foundational efforts via the World Inequality Lab. In one of his landmark papers that appeared in Nature Sustainability, Luca made explicit for the first time the link between income inequality and inequality in CO2 emissions at the global scale. So, as he writes repeatedly, all humans contribute to climate change, but not equally. So in other words, inequality in income and wealth directly translates into inequality in contributions to climate change, and equally important, inequality in the capacity to respond to it. Crucially, it is my impression that Luca's contributions also highlight that the top 1%, both within countries and at the global scale, and even more so the group of global billionaires, are a distinct socioeconomic group, not only in terms of the vast share of income they receive, not only in terms of the extreme share of wealth they control, but also in terms of their disproportionate contribution to global emissions. Global emissions not only affecting this distinct socioeconomic group, but everyone. This group of the top 1% is responsible for a carbon footprint many times greater than that of an average citizen, not to speak of an average citizen of a low-income country. At the same time, their financial and political power shapes the very structures that sustain both inequality and environmental degradation. Already in his book, Unsustainable Inequalities, that has been selected as one of the best books in economics by the Financial Times, one of the best science books by Nature, Luca has shown that those who emit the most, typically, as we know now, the wealthiest, are also those who have the greatest access to environmental resources, broadly understood, yet they face the least exposure to climate risks and enjoy the greatest capacity to protect themselves. So it is precisely Luca's work that brought to our knowledge what I think is kind of an inversion of the one hand responsibility for the climate crisis, and on the other hand, vulnerability and means to be able to adapt. An inversion that seems to be at the heart of today's climate injustices. Only recently, a piece that was published in Nature Climate Change, Luca had laid out the first explicit framework that allows us to understand the interplay between wealth inequality and climate inequality. Again, this framework rests on his foundational work on wealth inequality that stresses the distinct nature of wealth, how wealth is different from income in terms of its impact on well-being, in terms of its role for power and influence, imbalances or inequalities. This framework also reveals, and this is why I do think it's so important, that we really need to understand the interrelationships between wealth inequality and climate change, especially if we are to develop serious policy responses to climate change that desire to stand on broad public support. So, recognizing these relationships, Luca has also made one of the most concrete, one of the most compelling policy proposals in the current global climate debate. The introduction of a global wealth tax on multimillionaires and global billionaires, specifically designed or targeted to fund climate adaptation and loss and damage in low-income countries. So we learned that a small tax starting at a tax rate of only 1.5% on global wealth exposed on a very small group of people, roughly 70,000 individuals globally, would be able to close the current funding gap for climate change adaptation policies, raising around 300 billion each year. Importantly, I think with this proposal, Luca reframes climate finance as not merely a question of generosity towards low-income countries, but of accountability, also of fairness, and linking those who have gained most from carbon-intensive growth to those who now disproportionately bear the costs. So let me now turn to the third and final dimension, deliberation. What I mean is that Luca is an outstanding scholar in terms of, as he is here today, engagement with broader publics, with the public discourse. So he speaks to broader audiences, writes for them, and thereby contributes to shaping our collective understanding of these multiple inequality crises. And in this sense, his work also really exemplifies what Karl Polanyi saw to be one of the tasks of economists, of political economy, to bring moral and also social questions back into our analysis of the economy, of markets, and also to open, as we do here today, economic thinking to democratic deliberation. In today's debates around climate inequality, also the role of the state, Luca's work reminds us that rigorous research must not be afraid of asking the question, what is the world or the society we want to build and live in? And so it is precisely this combination of foundational data work, innovative conceptual frameworks, and public reasoning that I feel makes Luca's work so powerful. And it is thus an honor to celebrate him here today, not only as a scholar, but also as a thinker who redefines the boundaries of economic research in the service of justice and democracy.
Thank you, Fanziska. Lucas. Yeah, as you have heard, no, it's not your lecture yet. Please come. We have to be first kind of granted the scholarship and get an applause by the audience before giving you a lecture. We are very happy that you came to Vienna. We are very happy that you share your knowledge. And without further ado, we hand over. Thank you very much. And we are happy to have you. Just one photo and then the lecture.
Guten Abend. Ich habe Deutsch gelernt im Gymnasium, aber ich habe alles vergessen. So, I will continue in English. I'm truly honored and humbled by this visiting professorship. So I wanted to thank you all for being here, and I wanted to warmly thank the organizers of this event and of the professorship. So the Karl Polanyi Society and Andreas, thank you so much for making this possible. The city of Vienna, Bernadette, thank you very much for the words. The Veronika and Bernadette for VU University, as well as this venue. So this is a fantastic place to be giving this lecture. I also wanted to thank all of you for being here. This is past 6 p.m. So to talk about energy, inequality, and maybe a little bit of democracy. I think it's, thank you very much for making the way to this event. We've had a few, so this is the public event of a week of lectures with great students from VU and other universities in Vienna, and we've had great exchanges and discussions over the past few days, and we'll continue to have those exchanges in the coming days. So I'm also really thankful for that. And unfortunately, the rooms at university would not be able to host all of you. But I think this lecture tonight is one part of what we're discussing over the week. And so I will try to focus on a subset of topics relating inequality and climate change. And the title of this talk is Inequality, Energy, Democracy, a brief and political history of energy regimes. So here's where I want to go. The energy transition is going to force stark choices that are not just about the right mix of technologies or the good dose of energy reduction or reduction in material use, which I call sobriety here, but also about power relations. And since the 19th century, in fact, there has been a rich history of political struggle over who should own and control energy production, distribution, and use. In the 21st century, the actors, these can be individuals, these can be firms, these can be states, these can also be not-for-profit actors, I'll discuss that in a minute. Those who control low-carbon technologies will shape the path not just of the transition, but also of the global and national distributions of wealth. So I think it's time to bring these debates in the open so that citizens can choose how energy assets should be governed, should be controlled, should be owned. So this means politicizing energy and ecologizing politics. So this is where I will try to go in this lecture. But to start, I wanted to introduce you to this man. This is Matthew Boulton. So a British man, a British entrepreneur who in 1759 inherits from the family business. The family business is about making small metal tools in Birmingham, England. And by 1775, Mr. Matthew Boulton meets another man, an investor, who has started a project that's close to financial bankruptcy. Mr. Boulton starts to discuss, to exchange, and decides to, in the end, invest in this project. This project is about producing machines that, out of steam, generate mechanical power. The associate of Mr. Boulton is a man known as Mr. James Watt. In 1776, so 1 year after their association, the British elite is already quite intrigued and interested by what is happening in the factories of Mr. Boulton. So that is the site where the Watt and Boulton steam engines were produced. And there's a biograph that follows Mr. Boulton. And Mr. Boulton shows the compound and turns in a great room of machines full of sweat, full of men, full of metal. And he says, I sell here what all the world desires to have, power. So playing on the double meaning of power, mechanical power, but also social, political, economic power. And so that's the question that I would like to ask tonight is, how has energy shaped power inequality throughout history? What paths have societies taken in deciding who owns and who controls energy? And how might the transition reshape this, reshift these inequality and power relations? This lecture, this talk, is part of a broader project, which is a new project, which is a quantitative history of energy and inequality. And there have been energy histories before. In fact, this is a growing and rich field of study and inquiry. And I wanted to give here a tribute to Václav Smil, who's a well-known scholar, author, who produced many books on the topic of energy transitions throughout history. So these are quantitative accounts of energy transitions, energy consumption, of the great capacities, possibilities produced by the use of energy for human civilization. These are largely looking at the matter from a technical and physical perspective. There are other accounts of energy history, more qualitative, but looking at the political economy of energy, at the power relations of energy. For instance, Andreas Malm's landmark book, 2016, or Timothy Mitchell, 2011. So these reveal the power dynamics at stake, but I think we can learn from both types of inquiry, both the quantitative dimension and the qualitative and power questioning of inequality, power from a social perspective. So this is what we're trying to do in this project, so build new database of historical energy consumption and production that also looks at ownership structures, that also looks at who controls, who owns, who manages energy. So, a few questions. The energy transition, could it be a big boon for the global super-rich? The global super-rich, as was discussed in the introduction, disproportionately contributes to global pollution. But at least some of them, and they look quite happy here about what might come in the next few decades. I don't know if they know. We don't know what might come. They look quite happy about it. Some of them have a plan about the energy transition, about low-carbon energy assets. If they do invest, thanks to their financial firepower, in energy transition assets, might this be a boon for them? Another question which we might want to ask ourselves is, maybe some other elites who concentrate a lot of political but also financial economic power might benefit from energy transition pathways. Or, in the end, can the energy transition be a tool for more democracy? This picture was taken in some energy cooperative, so low-carbon energy cooperative in Spain, 2019, where cooperators here are debating, voting about where to invest next, what should be the prices of energy that is produced by the cooperative. So what I will show in this lecture, in this presentation, is that if we look at these things, at these topics from a historical perspective, here you have the US, France, UK, India, and what the graph shows is the share of electricity production that is owned, that is produced by assets owned by either government actors or cooperative and non-profit actors. If you go towards the top of the graph, that's more public and cooperative ownership of energy, electricity here in this case. You see that there's quite a vast diversity of ways that countries, that societies have chosen to control, to own the electricity sector, and in fact this is going to extend to the oil sector, to the coal sector, to the gas sector, and tomorrow, well, we'll have also important choices to make about who owns low-carbon sectors. The wind sector, the PV sector, the battery sector, the energy transmission sector. So that's one of the general messages of this talk and of this research so far, diversity of ownership trajectories over time. Now, the trajectories that we will decide, that countries will decide, or that will be imposed to them, will have some important implications for global inequality measured as the distribution of wealth. So this is a result from work recently published with several colleagues, where we look at the share of wealth owned by the global top 1%, the 1% richest at the global level. They make about 39% of all the wealth there is to own on the planet. And there are two scenarios here between now and 2050. In one scenario, we look at what could be their wealth share if the global top 1% was making and then owning all the energy transition-related investments. So you invest, and then you own all these new assets that are necessary in order to reduce our CO2 emissions. And I will discuss in a few slides what actually we're talking about when I talk about energy transition assets. Well, in this case, the top 1% global wealth share could rise quite substantially, up to 46% in this scenario. Now, other pathways are possible. And these scenarios are not here to tell us what the future will be. They're just here to show us that given the size of investments required, of assets that will have to be developed, that will have some economic value in the decades to come, there is scope potentially for important inequality increase or inequality reduction as well. In the second scenario, the top 1% is put to contribution, but through a tax to finance public assets, or assets owned by other actors, not them. For instance, cooperative, or it could be regions, or it could be the rest of the population. In that case, the share goes down. So the point here is that energy ownership matters, and it is likely to matter quite a bit when we think about inequality, when we think about the distribution of wealth in the future. So here is how I will try to structure this discussion in the time remaining. I will look at the physical and inequality landscape. So where are we right now in terms of inequality and in terms of CO2 emissions? Then I will discuss how energy and inequality intersect and interact. And then I will introduce this concept of energy regimes. And I will show that there has been quite a diversity of energy regimes over the past 100 years. And it's likely that we will also see a world with a diversity of energy regimes in the decades to come. The question is, to what extent can citizens have a voice in the organization, in the definition of what these energy regimes might be in the 21st century? All right, so this is just a few reminders. The world is in unknown territory. For the past 800,000 years, with humans and human societies have always evolved within a relatively narrow range of CO2 emission concentrations, CO2 concentrations for the matter, between around 200 parts per million and 300 parts per million. The value for 2025 comes from our great US colleagues, data that has not yet been deleted and suppressed by the Trump administration. 428 parts per million, according to Mauna Loa Observatory. So an unprecedented increase at an unprecedented speed. And if we look at the past 10,000 years, basically since the Neolithic Revolution, these CO2 emission concentrations in the air have basically been very stable. So here again, a huge increase in a very short amount of time. What does this due to? We know this very well. Global CO2 emissions since 1825, the past 200 years, 2,650 gigatons, billion tons of CO2 released in the atmosphere and still counting. About 1/3 of this due to deforestation, the rest, most of the rest due to fossil fuels. Nothing new here. Now, these fossil fuels, of course, are associated with the energy system, at least most of them. And over the past 200 years, fossil fuels have stacked up in global energy use. You see here in yellow, that's the amount of coal. So that's primary energy expressed in terawatt hours. Coal, and stacked up on coal, oil, and stacked up on that, gas. So from this perspective, some scholars, authors, have recently argued that the energy transition is a myth. We shouldn't even use this word because actually we've never gotten out neither of coal, nor of oil, nor of gas. Well, from this perspective, it is a fact that we're just stacking up fossil fuel sources over fossil fuel sources. That being said, I think it's important to have the global picture. It's also very important to look more closely at the dynamics that are happening within countries, to look at what is happening, how things are boiling under the cover of the global picture here. But clearly, we're very, very far from, any meaningful or significant transition at the global level at this stage. Now, in terms of inequality, a few basic facts as well. So, basic fact number one, this is income and wealth inequality today, 2023, as per the latest data of the World Inequality Database. The top 10% of the world make about a little more than 50% of incomes. The bottom 50%, less than 10% of incomes. So that's for income inequality on the left-hand side. Wealth inequality is more unevenly distributed, more concentrated than income. So the top 10%, the richest 10% of the world population, 1 person in 10, makes about 3/4 of everything there is to own on this planet. And the bottom half of the population owns less than 2% of everything there is to own on this planet. So this is, stark level of wealth concentration. That's the global level. Now, if we look at countries, I'm not showing the graphs here, but if we were to look at countries, we also see very low shares of wealth possessed by the poorest half of the population. So even in European countries, the bottom 50% of the population typically owns around 5% or less of the total. So wealth inequality is very extreme at the global level, but it's also quite significant, quite strong within countries as well. Now, inequality fact number two, contemporary capitalism or the economic system is characterized over the past decades by the rise of the global super-rich. So in the blue line here is the evolution of wealth owned by the bottom half of the world population. So if we talk about adults, 2.7 billion people. The red curve is the top 0.001, that's about 54,000 adults. They own significantly more than the bottom half of the world population, and their share has been rising quite significantly over the past years and decades. Now, so that was my fact number two. Rising wealth inequality at the very top. Now, fact number three, and quite important for the next stages of the discussion tonight, is this. Countries have become richer, in particular rich countries have become richer over the past few decades. Their governments, most of them, have become poor. So these spaghettis here inform us about the evolution of private wealth at the top. So private wealth is all the wealth that is detained, possessed by private actors, net of their debts. And the spaghettis at the bottom is wealth that is possessed by public actors, whether federal level, regional level, municipal level, net of their debts. Over the past 5 decades, a relatively important decline in public wealth ownership under the effect of rising debt and privatizations. So the situation in which governments find themselves in the early 2020s is a situation that governments don't like so much to be in. In fact, in history, governments, they don't like this so well, and so typically they develop answers to that, which might be sometimes debt cancellations, might be quite chaotic as a solution, taxes on the very rich. Not easy to do, but this is what some of these governments have done in the past when they found themselves in these situations. Inflation also can have pretty important distributional consequences, can also be quite chaotic. But governments don't like this situation so much. Why? Because the room for maneuver when you're in this situation as a public actor are relatively limited. When the assets you own are close to equivalent to the debts you have, and sometimes are even lower than all the debts you have, which is the situation when you have a negative position here, this is something that weakens public actors, in particular in the face of potential important investments that they may want to make in the decades to come, related to the energy transition, related to old age and the treatment of old age issues, for instance, or in terms of health investments. But this is the situation in which we are today. Now, maybe a little note, the rise of private wealth is not an issue in itself. It could be well distributed and everybody could benefit from rising private wealth. Now, what we've seen is that this rising private wealth has been largely associated with a rising concentration of wealth. Okay, so that's it for the landscape. Now, let's try to discuss how energy and inequality might relate with one another. And the following graph comes from a paper that was cited during the introduction, where with colleagues, we look at what we've called here the triple climate and inequality crisis. So in red, that's the illustration, an illustration of the distribution or the inequality of losses related to climate change. More precisely here, it's relative losses. How much people will feel a hit to their income due to climate damages. 75% of relative losses are concentrated among the bottom 50% of the world population. Just 3% for the top 10%. And this is a reverse mirror image of who pollutes. So inequality in emissions, by this measure of emissions, and I'll discuss in a few slides that there are in fact many ways to think about contributions to pollution. In this data series, the top 10% contribute to about half of total emissions, although they take only 3% of relative losses. And now, another important part of the inequality related to carbon emissions, so pollution associated to mostly energy use, is the capacity to act, the capacity to finance, potentially, solutions related to decarbonization. And here, what you have is basically the blue bars, which is the wealth inequality distribution that was presented in one of the earlier slides. So top 10% own more or less 3/4 of everything there is to own. So this creates somewhat a vicious cycle between fossil energy use and socioeconomic inequality. Now, I just mentioned a few seconds ago that there might be different ways to measure or to think about pollution contributions. Pollution can be thought of from the perspective of consumers. As a consumer, I might use energy, and this energy might be related to some CO2 emissions. Now, individuals are not all just consumers. Some of us might own assets. They might own firms that pollute. They might have some responsibilities over what the trajectories of these firms are in terms of decarbonization. So what we do here with our colleague Yannick is we look at the emissions associated with private capital ownership. So that is the ownership of firms that have some emissions that are owned by private actors. This represents 60% of all emissions worldwide. And when we do this, well, we see an even starker concentration of emissions among the top 10%, here close to 76%. So this is emissions from a control perspective. Now, these two previous graphs, these two previous slides show us the picture today. They show us what is happening at the end of the pipe, so to say. And I think actually it's important to understand how we got there. And so, to do that, I'd like first to introduce this idea of at least how we may want to conceptualize what an energy regime is. An energy regime consists here of actors, which can be political authorities, individuals, firms, civil society, which will have some forms of control over energy assets. They might own, they might manage, they might regulate, they might influence energy assets. And by energy assets, think about the energy system, what some have called the energy system, which is resources, which is capital to extract, to transform, to distribute, to use energy. And these energy assets produce services to serve the needs of people, to serve the needs of firms, to serve the needs of societies. Now, different types of actors might own, might control the energy system. You can think of private ownership. So that's an 1878 share of Standard Oil company that own capital, that also own fields. Public ownership might, thanks to law, be transferred to the public sector. 1946, nationalization of electricity and gas in France. And another law might just reverse that. This is what happened, 1986, British Gas in the UK. The minimum investment for British gas shares will be no more than £150. And ownership can also be in the form of cooperative. So this is a board meeting of who's your energy cooperative in the US. And of course, when we're thinking about different modes of ownership of energy, and we're doing this in Vienna, municipal ownership might also be an important way to own, to control energy assets. Indeed, this is not just about this city, and there's a long tradition of municipal ownership of energy in Europe and throughout the world. Why does all this matter in the context of the transition? Well, first, it might matter because it has mattered over the past 100 years and more. There are important theoretical and political debates related to the ownership of energy. John Stuart Mill, famous classical economist, wants, and so he witnesses the first gas distribution networks. And he warns of risks of monopoly and rents in certain sectors, starting with energy, utilities, if some actors are able to get control of these assets that are in situation of monopoly. And he would favor municipal ownership of these assets in such situations. Harold Hotelling is another quite famous environmental economist of the 20th century, and a little less known for his view on energy ownership. He says that in many cases, in the cases of utility, think about a gas plant, an electricity plant, in these cases, society is better off to tax the wealthy and to have a public ownership of the firm, who would then sell the energy at its marginal production cost. So there are important theoretical debates about who should own energy, and there are indeed strong political debates. So Roosevelt, before getting to power, says that in his programs, he says, and in his meetings, that he wants an electricity corporation closed with the power of government, possessed of the flexibility and initiative of private enterprise. And in fact, he also repeats this in front of Congress before the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's a federal government-owned electricity production company. Margaret Thatcher, that's the other side of the aisle, who says, in fact, socialization of energy is really not the good way to have the best value for the taxpayer. Let's privatize all of this. So, electricity of ownership matters if we look at debates. Ownership of energy might also matter when we look at what happened in real life. This is the American streetcar scandal of 1949. So that's the date when General Motors and one of the Standard Oil companies and many other transport car manufacturers and oil firms were condemned by US courts for getting together and creating an unlawful entente whereby they would buy the electric streetcar companies in several cities in the US just to make them go bankrupt, because that was a competitor for the automobile industry and for the oil industry. So those who own current energy assets might have the power to block the newcomers. We've also seen this in the US in the 1930s, late 1930s, early 1940s, where you have some brilliant MIT scholars who developed this decentralized solar houses. Homeowners, some of them are interested, decide to build these homes, but for the matter, in that case, electricity distributors, some of them told these homeowners that, well, actually, we will not connect you to the grid if you build these homes, because the demand for electricity would be lower in these homes than in non-solar houses homes. So here again, those who own the energy system might have the power to block any transition. Under conditions, public and non-profit actors may be better positioned to prioritize sufficiency over demand growth and act in a systemic way. Reducing energy use may conflict revenue models, investment logics, and political reluctance to challenge consumption norms. So here I'm not making a claim that public or not-for-profit ownership is a panacea. No, it needs conditions to work. But there are good arguments in favor of public or not-for-profit ownership, in particular from the perspective of demand, energy demand reduction, of sobriety, which is key for the transition. So now that we've discussed how inequality and energy interact, what are energy regimes, or at least one way to think about energy regimes, let us look at the diversity of energy regimes throughout history. And I'll be particularly interested in transfers of wealth ownership between public sector or government-owned or municipally owned or not-for-profit owned firms versus investor-owned or private sector. So this is the production of coal in the UK, 1825-2025. In blue, investor-owned firms. In orange, government-owned firms. So there's a short period of mixed ownership. And 1946, starting in fact 1st January 1947, the nationalization of coal in Britain. Similar story in France, except there's no privatization at the end of the period. This did not, there's a cutoff on these graphs. It looks like it happens, there's a law that is passed, but in fact, these dynamics developed over decades. In the 1880s, unions and socialist groups pushed for socializations of mines and utilities. In the 1910s, nationalization is promoted to reduce inequality and also enable economic planning. In the 1920s, in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party is all in favor of socialization, and the MP leading the socialization bill, which will fail in 1920, which will pass right after the Second World War, says, "I could never believe that God placed in the bowels of the earth the coal for the benefit of less than 4,000 people out of the 45 million in this country." So there's a clear inequality reduction objective here. Roosevelt, 1933, I cited him just a few slides ago, creates the Tennessee Valley Authority. A year after Congress passed this bill that favored rural electricity cooperative, so a really decentralized approach to socialization of energy. Now, the real big shift in terms of nationalization of energy happens post-Second World War. Major nationalizations, coal, gas, electricity, 1946, 1948. All these events raised major technical, legal, political challenges, especially around how to compensate former owners, how to organize these new systems. Several disputes reached the courts. This was a complicated business. But it's a business, complicated story that found solutions. That found solutions given that governments, now that had managed to combine support from the left and from parts of the conservatives, who saw in socialization of energy or nationalization of energy a tool for energy independence and planning. So, socialization, nationalization can serve throughout history different objectives. Reduce inequality between energy users, between locations, between owners and non-owners, but also contribute to industrial strategy. What's also important to have in mind when we look at this history is that it took different forms. In some cases, regional boards. That's the British gas nationalization, with representatives of unions, businesses, local authorities at the regional level. France chose a different pathway, much more centralized approach. And as I just discussed, the US opted for a fairly important dose of local not-for-profit actors. So that's our National Coal Board on behalf, managing the colliery, the mine, on behalf of the British people, January 1st, 1947. So that's US electricity production and sorry, this is not France, this is US. Sorry for that. This is a New Deal legacy, and we see that most of electricity remains owned by the private sector in the US, but there's a fairly important amount of electricity produced by public, federal, state, municipal, and not-for-profit actors even today, around 30% of the total. This is one of the assets owned by the federal governments, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And over the past 4 decades, this movement of nationalization faced calls for privatization, as we may know. Some countries have resisted to that. So here there are also different trajectories in how countries faced the privatization movement. So this is electricity production and capital ownership in France, with some degree of privatizations by the 2000 onwards, with most of the electricity sector still owned by companies owned by the French government. The UK followed a different path. Wide-scale privatization of energy. This is in the oil sector. That's oil production and capital ownership. So BP, owned by the British government up to 1979. Margaret Thatcher privatizes it. We might wonder here what would have happened to British climate policy if it had stayed under government control. We might argue that this would actually give a new tool, another tool for the British government to achieve some climate objectives. Some might also argue that, in fact, this might make more difficult for the British government to push forward ambitious climate targets. These are just speculations, but for sure, the equation would be quite different if BP was still under British government ownership. Now, what is a fact is that energy assets of different kinds have been owned by private, public, cooperative entities throughout the past 150 years. So here we see the different types of energy assets, the resource extraction technologies, transformation, distribution, different kind of actors, and we can find examples, many examples throughout regions throughout the world of these different forms of ownership. And so here I'm back to the main figure that I presented at the beginning of the talk, dynamics of energy ownership, huge degree of freedom to organize energy control. I will skip these few slides for in the interest of time, and if someone can tell me how much more time we have. Some more. Okay, no, I'm skipping this. The point was just to show that there's the diversity of ownership patterns. There's also a diversity of energy mix. So these are in kilowatt-hours per person per day. Let me just go through this rapidly and come to energy ownership in the 21st century. I talked about France, maybe rapidly mentioned Sweden, very low carbon intensity of electricity in these two countries, one of the lowest in the world. We have two energy regimes here with a relatively high degree of public ownership. But again, these are two countries that followed different socialization strategy. In Sweden, relatively large municipal ownership, seen as a way to accompany actors in reducing demand for energy. France, centralized nuclear, seen as key to the country's energy independence. So here I'm not making claim on the benefits of nuclear, huge and unresolved challenges associated with safety, proliferation, cost management. The point is that the two countries followed fairly different socialization pathways, and they both managed to have fairly good carbon intensity electricity numbers. Now, who should own energy technologies in the 21st century? So some have a plan. If you haven't looked at the Tesla master plan, I encourage you to do so. There's no reduction in demand. Of course, Tesla would like to play a huge role in this full decarbonization of the world that they anticipate, not just through producing electric cars, but also producing batteries, also producing solar panels that they own and that they lease, that they rent to families. It's already the case. Others have a plan. China also has a master plan, so to say, and has been developing this plan over the past 40 years. And if you look at the 5-year plans of the country, it's very clear where the country has wanted to go over the past decades. Now, when we look at what happened in the electricity sector and in the solar PV production sector, one striking thing is the huge reduction in the cost of production of electricity from solar PV. So this is a log scale, right? So starts at 10,000, the bottom is 10. So solar PV's cost has declined massively. Nothing new here, but still is always very striking when we see this graph. The subsidies for production in China contributed to this decline. Subsidies for consumers in Europe also contributed to this decline. The thing is, you have two countries or regions here that follow very different approaches. Support consumer demand in one case, support your production base in the other. This is pretty clear when you look at subsidies, China, EU, US, so that's a broader argument, industrial subsidies, not just for the energy sector, but it's very visible here. One of the results of that in Europe is that, decline of the European PV and wind industry. Was it really the only possible outcome for European low-carbon industries? Boom and bust in the number of jobs. So in many ways, Europeans favored consumption over production and structuring an industrial base. Now, PV and wind might be already over for European producers, but the new frontier of the discussion is tilting towards energy storage. Northvolt, some of us might be aware of this battery producers, late 2024, still presented as a world leader, a European champion of batteries, 50 billion in deals, bankruptcy in March 2025. No EU state invested in it. We might want to ask if this is a missed opportunity for European countries. 1970, Airbus also is facing huge financial technical challenges. The German and the French government decide to support it because they think it is a strategic industry. They want production on their soil. So Airbus was under public ownership for some years, especially when the industry faced some challenges. So far, we're very far from the entrepreneurial state that some colleagues, including Mariana Mazzucato, are calling these days. So before I conclude, let's maybe have a quick discussion about the amount of investment needs and focusing on the European Union. According to the European Central Bank, an annual additional investment needs of around 3% of GDP is needed. So that's a fairly significant amount. One key question is, how much should public actors step in to fill this gap? And how much private actors should step in? So there's no optimal level here. The European Central Bank makes some estimates, says maybe 20% on the basis of previous year investments, 20% public sector, 80% private sector. In fact, this is a very political discussion to have. In any case, if the public sector should step in more, where should the money come from? So here there's a role for public debt. Of course, many European countries are in deficit, but we're currently loosening rules related to defense. Why is it that what is possible for defense spending or investments is not possible for energy transition, which also is of strategic importance for European security in the future? Taxation is another way to give governments leeway for maneuver. And progressive taxation is a way in order to increase revenues without hitting the middle class or low-income groups. There are currently discussions on a global minimum tax on billionaires in the context of the G20 last year. European states don't necessarily need to wait for global discussions to happen in order to implement such taxes. Some European countries have taxes on the very wealthy. So I'll skip this and this to say that the ultra-wealthy and large firms have lowest effective tax rate, just establishing a level playing field between the ultra-wealthy and the rest of the population, between large firms and other smaller, medium enterprises, could raise 1% of GDP. So now, just doing this would pave some of the way towards the big sums that I presented earlier. Wouldn't be able to do everything, but that's also already a very good way to start. Let me conclude by saying that the European social state is at a crossroad. So this is the total value of taxes as a share of national income. It's an indicator very close to GDP. Was less than 10% in 1910. When Polanyi finishes his book, about 25%, finishes the Great Transformation, and big rise in the European social state. So this is the average between France, Germany, the UK, and Sweden, but fairly representative of many European countries. There seems to be a plateau since the 1980s, and maybe a slight reduction since then. Where is this going to go in the decades to come? And what role for the energy transition in the continuation of the rise that we've observed over the 20th century, or stagnation, or even decline? 40%, if we continue some of the trends we observed. 48% here. What I do in this scenario is I just plug in the 3% additional investment needs as per the European Commission, and we assume that this is 100% public. This is up for debate. This is up for discussion. And so I'll skip that and I'll conclude here. Radical transformation of economy and energy system is required to get to full decarbonization. Ownership of energy assets is going to be key for the future of inequality. We've observed a large diversity of ownership and use pathways over time and countries. Public and not-for-profit of energy can be a tool for reducing inequality tomorrow, also to accelerate the transition towards low carbon and sober energy lifestyle. What is clear is that there is no optimal level here. It's ultimately a matter of democratic debate. So I think it's time we seriously take on this discussion, because as Matthew Bolton used to say, energy is indeed about power relations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Luca, for this. Thank you, Luca, for this exciting talk. The proceeding for the time to come is that we have one comment now on Luca's presentation, and then the floor is open to questions from the audience. So if you have questions, think about them. I will call some of you afterwards. But before this, I'll ask Judith Derndorf from the Vienna Chamber of Labor to give her comment. She is a researcher on equality and labor market, and therefore well suited to give this comment.
Sorry, you already compiled.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, for having me here to comment today, and of course, thank you very much, Luca, for this very inspiring and insightful talk. So, let me start with a quote by Friederike Otto from her book Climate Injustice. She states that obviously we need to transform the way in which we obtain energy, but above all, however, we need to transform participation in social life and the application of political and economic power. Who makes the decisions and how? And I think that this quote really links very well what you have discussed and what you kind of put out there for us to have a conversation about, because I think if we want to talk about who owns energy and who controls energy, we should also look on, we need to transform who makes the decisions and how. And I want to start my comment by taking a step back and looking at, okay, who actually has a say in our democratic process and who hasn't, so to say. Because I think that we really need to look at the functioning of democracy before we can also discuss on how ownership should look like. So let me start with the example of Vienna that you have also given. It is the largest regional energy provider in Austria, and it is indirectly owned by the city of Vienna, sowie the Stadtwerke GmbH. And also, just a month ago, we had the municipal elections in Vienna, so on the 27th of April. And if we look at who actually can vote in Vienna, so it is 36% of Vienna's voting age populations who were excluded from voting because they don't have the Austrian citizenship. If we look at the young people from 16 to 30-year-olds, 44% were excluded from being able to vote and decide how the municipal council looks like. So I think we really should discuss, if we want to talk about democratic processes, we need to discuss citizenship. And this is another quote from Lea Ippi, who was here last week to give a speech to Europe.
And she says that once citizenship becomes again citizenship for a restricted few, a commodity to be bought, sold, and exchanged, democracy degenerates into a form of oligarchy for which wealthy elites control political power. When citizenship is bought and sold, instead of being a vehicle of political emancipation, it becomes a vehicle of oppression. So I think we should really talk about who gets to decide on this energy and economic system, and therefore we should reduce legal barriers to citizenship. I mean, this is true in Austria, but also elsewhere, or grant really voting rights to have a table of the discussion. But I think at the same time, we also need to ensure that wealthy individuals are not treated preferentially, so that we don't give the wealthy even more power and not the opportunity to buy themselves a citizenship, which is also possible in, or discussed in a few countries, or I think in the US there are some proposals right now. If you're super wealthy, then you can get your way into citizenship. And this would lead us from a system that we call democracy, which is one person, one vote, more into the direction of $1, one vote. And I think for the future being and to tackle all the problems that we're facing right now, we should really work against that. So this is one part of the story, but the other part of the story, sorry, it's a bit small, it's not just about who has the right to vote, so who is eligible to voting, but we know there's also quite a fair share of people who have the right, but who don't go to vote in those elections. And for this municipal election, it was the participation rate was around 60%, so 40% did not go to vote. So overall, we know that 40% of Vienna voting age population decided on the composition of the Viennese City Council, and those in turn then decide how Wien Energy is managed. So I really think that there should be a discussion on how to strengthen democracy. And we also know from research who is not going to the elections, so it's sometimes a lot of people with low income earners. But here I also want to stress another point, that we also need time as a resource for political participation. There's not so much research, or at least I haven't found so much, on time versus and political participation. But the two studies I found is one is quite old, so 30 years ago, and he and his colleagues, Brady, he looks at free time, so time not being spent in paid work, unpaid work, and sleeping, and this free time is positively linked with electoral participation. Then there's a newer study by Lee et al. From 2022 that looks at what about long working hours and unsociable schedules, working in the evening, nights or weekends. And they also find that there is a link between having those long working hours and unsociable schedules on electoral participation. And this is mostly among women, but also on low-skilled men. So I think we also, if we want to have a democratic debate on who owns the energy resources and who controls them, I think we really need to ensure that people have time to participate in these debates and how to transform it, because I really think that the solutions will be better and more broadly accepted if everyone has to have a say in these discussions. But there's, of course, more than just going to the elections and voting. There's also, we should talk about economic democracy, so we should try to strengthen workplace democracy, so representatives of the workers, work council, trade unions, and Chamber of Labor, where I'm coming from, believe we also need improved opportunities to actively participate in shaping the social and ecological transformation of economies. And especially if we talk about the energy sector, traditionally it has been very male-dominated, and excluding some of the voices, so females, but also other minorities, vulnerable groups, disadvantaged individuals. And I think that we also kind of need to do a better job to get more inclusive and more different perspectives to have in order to go forward. And since you showed the work on control of power on a global scale, I kind of take the opportunity to show you now the numbers for Austria, which colleagues and I, who are also here today, have been working on. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, it's more or less exactly the same what you showed on a global dimension. So we see in Austria that there's very high wealth concentration in Austria, and also high concentration of ownership-based emissions. So who controls it? It's the very wealthy, and this goes in line with economic and political power. So I believe that, of course, we should also have a discussion here in Austria, but also on a global level, about wealth taxation to finance transformation. I think what you also mentioned in your paper, that really we should look at how we design economic or climate policies. We should ensure that this doesn't exacerbate income and wealth inequality. And this, because I think if we have even higher concentration of wealth and then power, this will hinder us to really get forward with the transformation that we need. And last, I think, you said that it's kind of up for public debate, but I think the two questions on ownership and reduction of energy use, we should really have the discussion closely connected, because we really need to have the discussion not only who owns it, who controls it, but how as a society do we use the energy to, first, to maximize welfare, and second, to also stay within the donut. For those who are not familiar with Rohwurst's donut, so we really need to ensure that we kind of fulfill all the economics and basic needs of everyone, but again, that we keep not kind of cross the borders of, or to keep in mind that there are planetary boundaries, so we should kind of keep within those. And one of the questions I was also kind of thinking, or I think we also need more discussion on that, and you also mentioned that we need the condition of who owns it, and it's not per se the public ownership is better or cooperative is better, it's under the conditions. And if we think of some community energy projects, we should also discuss, okay, if it's cooperative owned, if there's a lot of grassroots democratic processes from this, how the energy is kind of produced. But I think we should also discuss for what is the energy used for. I mean, we have a lot of people in houses having their solar energy and then putting them together in an energy community, and they use that energy to power up their electric cars. I don't think that's gonna be the solution for it. And we also know that electric cars, maybe then they run on electricity, but still carbon is required in the steel production and the producing of the cars. So I think these two big questions, so who owns energy systems and which kind of policy mix or ownership, or maybe a mix thereof, is kind of the best or most promising to facilitate the energy reduction. And I don't know how much time it took, but I guess I'll come to my conclusion that I really want to stress that if we want energy ownership and control to be a democratic choice, we must really strengthen democracy. So we should kind of start there, and this can be like easier access to citizenship, ensure that people have the time resources to participate, enhance workplace democracy. I mean, we know there's a lot of things that we can improve in how our democracy is working, and we should really kind of use our energy to fix these problems, or at least discuss it. Then I think we should also kind of connect it to that debate how we can reduce energy use, and we must do so drastically. And I think this is not going to be easier. There's going to be struggles. People who have the power, who have the wealth. The first picture you showed us with the boons, the super rich, I think they're not going to be giving up anything easily. So I think there's a struggle to be had. And the last one I want to stress is that wealth taxation should be used as a source of financing the transformation, but also looking at how wealth inequality is not kind of ensuring that we establish a system that it doesn't even allow for this extreme wealth concentration and this extreme political concentration. And luckily, I don't need to convince the finance minister that wealth taxation would be a good tool. But I think your colleagues in the government, or there's still some people out there in the coalition party that still need some convincing. And I'm very happy that we have this debate here, and I think that we really should keep on having these very important debates and discussions how we can also kind of form or improve our futures to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. Luca, can you come to the microphone? And as I told you, now it's your chance to raise questions. Yeah. I take 3. One, the guy in front.
Yeah, thanks a lot for showing us those facets of the planetary burnout we're currently living in. Apart from the ecological crisis and limits, I think especially the wealthiest also face the limits of investment currently. So the classical investment pathways of intensification is very difficult. Opening up new markets is exactly what we see with the energy transition. And the third one would be destruction, which we also see everywhere popping out more and more with wars. And I think the wealth taxation is a nice tool, but is also more fighting a symptom than the real cause, no? Where we live in a world where we have on the one hand a financial system that is based on accumulation of the very rich, and the more you have, the better it goes. And on the other hand, we have a physical world that is based on the basic laws of thermodynamics and entropy, where everything with use has less available energy left. So how can we actually close this divide between those very different forms of how the world is working?
Thank you for the talk. I'm not quite sure how to formulate this as a question, but I was thinking about 3 other potential debates we probably should link this to. So the first thing is, we're talking here about we already have some existing regimes and how to transform it. And fortunately less and less, but I guess we also need a more global view, because we're talking about global transition, that in some places electrification is still underway. The second thing is that we maybe, like, how to link this to the degrowth debate, maybe, because we will need energy, but to what extent and for what and where? And the last thing that I think we should keep in mind is maybe geopolitics, because even if all energy is owned or produced publicly, we are now seeing that Russia is using gas as a weapon, for example. So how to think of that in a global context?
Thank you. Third row, the third one, and then a first round of answer.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I also have a small comment and a question. I do agree with you that public ownership is good from a power perspective, but I highly doubt or are very skeptical that public ownership will automatically lead to decarbonization, because we see that in Austria and public ownership doesn't really do that. So the question is, how can we ensure that also any type of ownership will reduce to a decarbonization of our energy system? And do you think that climate lawsuits, for example, the one in front of the European Court of Justice, can play a role in, raising incentives for governments to get their asses up?
Thank you very much. These are really great comments. So the starting point to connect the discussion with the physical limits, you cannot grow infinitely in a finite world. So the starting point of the discussion is there are physical limits that you cannot go over. Now the question is, how do we deal with the power relations that block the transition towards a world where we respect physical limits? And are we able to use this transition in a way that is also able to reduce wealth inequalities? So these are the questions that I'm trying to ask in this reflection. Now, I won't take all the comments in order, maybe because this really links with the degrowth discussion. So to me, the degrowth discussion, I think, can and should clarify what dose of private ownership of energy systems is compatible with degrowth objectives. What dose of public ownership, what dose of not-for-profit ownership. So who should control these energy assets? This is something I think needs to be clarified in many degrowth scenarios. I fully agree that there are many instances where public ownership is not necessarily decarbonizing. So here the point is not to say that all countries should follow 100% public strategy. In fact, what's pretty clear is that the diversity of trajectories that we've observed over the 20th century is very likely going to be continued in the 21st century. Now, what I'm trying to argue is two things. The first one is that if we want to reduce inequality by 2050, wealth inequality, wealth taxes are necessary but not enough. So another way to do that is to limit inequalities in their formation. And having public ownership or not-for-profit ownership of some key assets in the world tomorrow is one way to reduce the formation of high wealth concentration, of high wealth inequality. So that's one way to reduce inequality. So that's, the inequality part of the discussion. Now for the decarbonization part, public ownership or not-for-profit ownership works under conditions. And I think these conditions are strict, but are less strict than in the case of private ownership. Why? Because, of course, there are very important and key issues related to how do we organize control and how do we organize democracy of energy assets. And I think Judith's presentation really made that very clear. But I think the conditions for having private actors force a reduction in demand of their users are pretty extreme. And I'm all in favor of legal cases, regulations, carbon taxations, informational tools that governments can have. They should push forward all this. Now, what I'm trying to discuss here is that there are also tools related to the actual control of the energy asset, which I think should be debated a little more. That being said, in the case of France, for instance, the electricity actor, EDF, it is known that for many decades has blocked the development of alternative low-carbon energy sources. So if solar power and wind are quite low in France as compared to other European countries, it's because this actor that went all in nuclear from the 1970s onwards, didn't make it easy for alternative actors to get in. So there are also incumbent newcomer dynamics in the public sector as well, that's for sure. What I'm trying to argue is that it's a little better to organize this in a one-person, one-vote kind of system than in a $1, one vote kind of system. Now, on the geopolitics of the problem, so some countries, actors are using fossil energy as a tool for political power, definitely. And so, this is just another argument in favor of the acceleration of the transition. Now, the way I think about these geopolitics from the perspective of who owns energy assets is also from the point of view of how will low-income countries and let's say, a big part of the global south will be able to access relatively cheap, low-carbon technologies in the future. And here there really is a question about who owns the patents, who owns the knowledge that some countries will have to rely on. And I think that in the case of private actors, they will demand, and that's very fairly logic, that they will demand relatively good returns from the patents that they develop. Now, there's a case where we can think of more open access to patents, to energy technologies. When these are developed, when these are controlled, where these are owned by public actors. Here again, under strict conditions. It's one doesn't guarantee the other. But we've seen, for instance, in the case of COVID vaccines, that governments might put huge support to private firms to develop a COVID vaccine. And then when they are going to say, well, we gave you so many subsidies, so maybe you can, make these vaccine, available for everybody. Well, firms say, well, no, actually, it's our vaccines. Like, we developed the patents. So here, government actors find themselves in a situation where it's kind of difficult to regulate when things happen. So that's another argument in favor of more maybe open and publicly supported research on patents, which will be really key also for the global south to access these technologies that will help them decarbonize their energy systems.
Thank you. If we have so short and structured questions, I would suggest we have 2 more rounds of 3 questions. And as we had all on this side, we take here in front. Yeah, let's start with him, and then at the back.
Yeah, thank you, Karl from ISSET. Very, very interesting presentation. I've one maybe slightly unpopular question in relation to your wealth tax argument, because I feel I wonder how you may justify the argument for introducing a wealth tax for the climate transition beyond the obvious question of the need for doing so, and how would you do this in comparison to other principles that you could evoke, for example, polluters pays principle? Because you'd easily also say, well, look, there's fossil accumulated wealth in the economy that causes, for example, climate damages, and it's rather basically the remedy for these damages that we should actually seek in order to then finance the transition, but also accommodate basically adaptation and loss and damage responses that we require for the most vulnerable. So I kind of feel it would be interested in the nuance of how to justify that argument, and how maybe basically linking it to other debates that you would have in the climate space may be useful, or what the pros and cons of this question are. Thank you.
Thank you. Last row, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Jarmo Kikstra, also from IASA. Hi, Karl. Look, you're doing a lot of research and coordinating a lot of research, but especially for within country inequality, when it goes beyond income or wealth, there is quite a lack of empirical data. If you would have 1 billion for a research grant, what would you research?
Yeah, good question. Then I think,
hello, Werner Ratzer. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I have one comment with respect to your differentiation between public and private ownership and the role that should play in the 21st century when we speak about energy systems. I would argue that this differentiation is probably not the central one, because what we've seen over the last 40 years is not so much a change in formal ownership between private and public entities. What we've seen is a marketization, the introduction of a market and competitive logic in the energy market, via particularly the liberalization of the energy market in the European Union. So my point is, if we want to move towards an energy system in the 21st century, we have to speak about how we can reintroduce other logics, social provisioning logics, resilience, security of supply concerns, etc. And that's not directly attached to the question of ownership. It has to do with how these sectors and, if you want, markets operate. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, great round of reflections and comments. So on the wealth taxation discussion, there's a clear case of polluter pay principle when it comes to financing the transition. That's for sure. Now, for the past 200 years, the question of taxation has really been looked at and discussed from the perspective of those in capacity to pay should pay more to, help finance public goods. I think that's how the basics of the tax discussion in a democratic context has risen. And if we think about the amount of needs in terms of investments and in terms of public funding for the transition, I think that the polluter pay principle is important in the narrative, potentially in new tax proposals, and I've also contributed to, supporting some of these, wealth tax based on the carbon content of your assets. So I'm in favor of that. But in order to raise sums that might be 1%, 2%, 3% of GDP, the rates you need to put on each ton of CO2 are absolutely extreme. That's possibly one way to go. But I think that there's also, a very strong case to think about taxes as we've thought about them for the past 200 years, progressive taxation, basically, all the very, very wealthy contributing to a similar tax rate as the rest of the population. No, clearly not. It's not the case. So there's also a lot of revenues to be generated from this very simple rebalancing of the tax system. And I think that's another important way to think about it. And I would argue that we cannot only finance the transition through a polluter pay principle. So I think we really need both approaches, but they're not in opposition with one another. They complement one another. If I had 1 billion euros, what would I research? A very, very good question. There's one thing, when we're talking about wealth inequality data here, pollution data, there's one thing that some countries have and others don't. Norway, for instance, has a registry of assets. So basically, you have the different taxpayers in the economy. You know what firms they have, what assets they have. Of course, this needs to be really well monitored for privacy issues. But in so many countries, you don't have access to such information, which is key to design properly wealth taxes, potentially wealth taxes with pollution dimensions. And so designing data architectures really fit for the types of policies that we want to implement, that we may want to implement, like wealth taxes, pollution related to wealth taxes, or other forms of instruments. It can be also regulations. At some point, wealth tax or pollution taxes clearly are not sufficient. You want proper bans on fossil fuel assets. So basically, we may want to move towards a situation where it's not allowed anymore to own a very polluting assets, even if it's at the other end of the world. Because we might find ourselves in situations where you have a country, Denmark recently has decided to stop more drillings of fossil fuels, but it does not prevent its own citizens from owning such assets in the rest of the world. So you want to have data architectures that make it possible to see this, to know this, and the policy world to regulate that. And so this is really close, coordination between policymaking and research. But as we were discussing with the Karl Polanyi lecture seminar students yesterday, very often improvements or innovations in terms of data come with policy developments. So in the early 20th century, before the income tax were introduced, the progressive income tax, so the richer you are, the higher rate you pay. A lot of people were saying, but how are you going to do this? We don't know how much people earn. It's impossible to implement a progressive income tax. And the solution was, at the same time as the policy was introduced, progressive income taxation, governments created an observatory to understand how much people earn. And that's the birth of income tax statistics. So things go hand in hand, and that's where I think, the billions spent would be very well invested, and which would be able to collect much more than $1 billion. So very good investment. And on markets, I agree that, the question of ownership is not sufficient in itself. Now, I think that if one would want to move towards more of a sufficiency logic, the question of ownership is not sufficient, but it might be a necessary condition to move there. But for sure, the market logic in energy, has, many pitfalls. Now, in the case of, so I criticized EDF a few minutes ago, so the French electricity producer. Now, let me try to say some of the interesting things that you observe in these actors. There is a legal agreement between the firm and the French government, so the French people, renewed every 3 years, giving the strategy of the firm, which might include energy demand reduction, which is something that you would hardly see in many other, providers of electricity on the market. This is also something that you see quite clearly in municipal actors of district heating, combined heat and power in Sweden, for instance. So you can have contracts between a constituency and an energy provider when this provider has to answer a political body. And I think this is what we already see in some cases. But I agree that that's a very important point. If we want to decommodify energy, the question of ownership is important. It's not the end of the story.
Thank you. More questions? If there are questions?
It's already 8.
Yeah, that's why we are in the last round. So we have 1, we have 2, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
First you and then.
Thank you very much for your talk. I am a bit worried about public debate, and as you already also said before, public debate is a lot about defense right now and about AI, 2 fields where a reduction of emissions is very far from reality. So my question would be, where do you see the most potential to switch public debate again towards more climate protection?
Clear, short, thank you.
So I'm a little bit under the impression that when we speak about inequality from the left, we tend to wear at least 2 hats. When we talk about the economy, we wear the Keynesian hat, and we say that redistribution is good because it sustains aggregate demand. So what we obtain is higher aggregate consumption. When we speak about the environment, we tend to wear the ecologist hat, and we say, inequality is bad because all these rich are polluting a lot. And we implicitly hint at the fact that if the distribution was more equal, we would pollute a lot less. So my question for you is, how do we strike a balance? Do we have a convincing narrative that a more equal distribution of income and wealth could achieve both results, so welfare material welfare for everybody and a more sustainable planet?
Thank you. Last chance for one more question or not. That's what the chance is about. Yeah, thank you. You have 2 more questions to answer.
Okay, very simple questions to end the day with. and it's already 8, so I don't want to be long. And I think in a way they are connected. I think one way to move forward, talking about the ecological transition, is to further politicize it. I think that for too long, it has been thought that, just bringing in public domain the results from science is going to be sufficient to create electoral majorities. And we must acknowledge that this, unfortunately, has not worked so far. There's a recent work by a colleague, Nicolas Longuet-Marx, looking at the United States, that looks at how candidates for the Senate or the House of Representatives, the types of discourses they bring to the public discussion when it comes to the environment, and how voters are going to be able to vote for them or not. And what he shows, to simplify and make it rapid, is that when these candidates present the need for environmental protection as a value story, so climate justice story, or the need to listen to science, Democrat candidates have all the chances to be beaten up by their Republican opponents. When they show, they discuss about similar topics, but from the perspective of the material interests of their voters, so green jobs, jobs in a specific sector of the economy, then they have chances against their Republican opponents. I think it's very important here to have this material interest issue in mind. And in a way, this connects with the other question. So material interest, jobs, that's one part of the story. More consumption, the question is, what consumption? And so in the form of consumption of, there are many forms of public services that people might consume more in an energy transition scenario that might have relatively low material footprint. And when we're thinking about redistribution, and I think this talk was connected to this view of redistribution, it's not just redistribution of material stuff. It's also about redistribution of decision-making power over things in the economy. And I think that's one thing that's also important to have in mind. So not just redistributing material stuff, but also redistributing the right or the decision-making power. And I think that's an important addition to have in mind when we're thinking about inequality. And I think I will stop there because I don't want to be too long, and it's already 8:05, 8:06. Thank you so much.
I have one more slide. Thank you, Lucas. There was one more slide. Just an announcement before ending. There will be every semester Karl Polanyi, visiting professor. In fall, it will be at the University of Vienna. It's still in negotiation, but I can tell you that next spring, Isabella Weber, quite well-known German US living economist, will be the Polanyi visiting professor. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a nice evening and hope to see you at another occasion.